So I went to dinner last night, and I ordered a glass of wine, as you do in Vegas. And the waiter looked at me very skeptically. She asked for my ID. And I gave her my ID. She looks at my face. Her eyes dart back to the ID. Back to my face. Back to the ID again. She was very skeptical that I was of age. And I would imagine there are a few of you in this room that are maybe wondering the same thing. Who is this guy with the baby face that is trying to tell me what separates top-notch sales organizations from mediocre ones? So we're going to start with where I'm coming from, and then I promise I'll get to the more interesting stuff here. Currently, I'm head of product marketing at a company called Gong. I'm also head of our research insights. Who's heard of our research before? Show of hands. Somebody yell if they like our research. That's what I like to hear. Before that, I was actually a former quote-unquote competitor to Gong. I put quotes around that for a very intentional reason. That year and a half of my life is responsible for the majority of my gray hair. If you look closely, there's a lot of it, despite the baby face. This product marketing thing is a little bit new to me. I consider myself a sales guy in disguise. Sales and sales management at a company called InsideSales.com out of Utah. Any Utahns in the room? Represent. And I am also the proud father of two very charming children. They get that trait from their mother, I'm sure, who is gorgeous. But that's a little bit about me. Let's talk about the interesting stuff here. And I'm going to be, oh, I forgot a part. I brought this bag on stage. We are going to give away, I actually bought this last night, an Apple Watch Series 3. I'm not really with the times here. I actually had to ask somebody at Gong internally who's a lot more hip and cool than me. What do people like these days? And she recommended the Apple Watch Series 3. So I hope you guys like it. One of you will win it by the end of the day. That's why I bought it. Here's a hint. I'm going to tell you how to win this by the end of the presentation. So you don't get to know until then. Hopefully you guys stay because of that reason. Hopefully my presentation's good too. But here's a hint. Take some pictures. Take pictures of something that made you think differently or something you learned. It doesn't have to be of me. It can be of the slides. And I'll show you how to win at the end. So let's get into it. Product differentiation is dead today. The path to winning your unfair share of the market has shifted in the last 5 or 10 years. Let me soften the statement a little bit. Product differentiation is a ticket to play the game today, but it is not going to win your market by itself. Instead, the perception of difference in your buyers' minds happen during customer-facing conversations, what your sellers say, do, and write during the sales process. In other words, how you sell has become as or more important than what you sell. So how can I say this with any degree of credibility? Well, there is one trend that makes this true. And it is that almost every category in the B2B world is absolutely exploding with competitors. This is my favorite example, marketing technology. In 2011, which is the landscape we're looking at on the left-hand side, there were 150 vendors in the marketing technology world. Can anybody guess how many vendors there are today? Nancy Nardin, you cannot answer. Any guesses? Shout them out. 6,600? Too many? I mean, you can't go wrong with that. That's an easy way out. I've heard two numbers. Between 5,000 and 7,000. 5,000 and 7,000 vendors in one space. A unique product is not going to cut through that noise. So think about your space. Like, go back in time for a second. Close your eyes if you have to, if you're the Zen type, unlike me. How many competitors did you have 3, 5, 7 years ago? Probably looked something like this. Maybe a handful. Let's fast forward to today, though. I would imagine most of your spaces look something similar like this. If not in number of competition, then in intensity and strength. I have kids, they're not twins, but I'm going to illustrate this problem anyway. This proliferation in competition creates what I like to call the twin effect. If you are the parent of twin children, you can tell the difference between them pretty easily, I would imagine. You spend all day with your kids, or all night, if you're anything like me. A complete stranger on the street, though, probably cannot tell the difference between your twin children very easily. And it's the same problem with your product and your competitor's product. You spend all day with your product. You spend all day analyzing your product, and you probably spend a lot of time on your competitors' websites, or even with their products directly, analyzing the differences and nitpicking, and you know the differences like the back of your hand, and it just blows your mind that everybody else cannot see those differences. It's not so easy for your buyers, though. They don't spend all day with your product. They've probably seen a demo once or twice. They don't spend all day with your competitor's product. They've probably seen a demo once or twice. And so even though you do have a unique product, buyers come away with a surface level understanding of both of those products and lump them to being quote unquote identical. That leads to what I call the competitive bake-off. Your situation might be a little bit different, but this is how I've seen it play out in the sales organizations that I've worked with. You give your customer a dazzling product demo, and you think you did an amazing job, but your competitor did the same thing, and probably 2 other competitors did just as good a job as you. And so after seeing one demo from each vendor, your buyer feels a very keen desire to understand the differences between all these offerings. And they create this dreaded comparison spreadsheet. You one-up your competitor on feature A, they match you, one-up you on feature B. And so the story goes until the screen fades to black, and the quote-unquote winner in this scenario is the vendor who erodes the integrity of their pricing model. So what I skipped a slide. But this is what it looks like. This is what happens when a seller loses a competitive deal who relied on having a unique product. They walk away from the deal and go, look, they just didn't get it. They thought our products were identical. We all know they're not identical, so they started just grinding me down on price, and we're not gonna do that. We don't drop our pants, for lack of a better word. So the rest of this presentation is to help you understand how to get your unfair share of the market, not with what you sell, that's just a ticket to play the game, but with how you sell, your customer-facing conversations. And if you could distill that to one thing, which I will support in a few slides with some more data, so stay tuned. Sales organizations at market-leading companies, the ones that have market share 40%, 50%, 60%, they have one thing in common with their sales teams. They march in the same direction, they sing the same songs, they're in lockstep from rep to rep. There is not a lot of variation. People are not making things up and telling their own stories or executing their own types of sales call structures, or just doing vastly different things. So imagine for a second that you are a race car driver in the Grand Prix, racing through the winding streets of Monaco. You got the fastest car, you have high-octane fuel, you have a world-class crew, and you've been training for years. But while your competitors zip along the harbor like electric slot cars, you sputter. And it turns out this is the reason. Each of your wheels, just slightly, are pointed in different directions, just a little bit. One's 4 degrees this way, 3 degrees this way, etc. And it creates tremendous friction in a moving forward motion that costs you the race, and you lose to those cars who have fully aligned wheels. Well, the race to winning your unfair share of the market is not incredibly different than winning the Grand Prix in Monaco. I know nothing about Monaco. I'm assuming it's called Grand Prix, for the record. I don't really know. You need a great product. That would be your car. You need high-octane fuel. That would be funding from supportive investors. You need the best crew, or team, and spades of experience. But I'm willing to bet almost all of your competitors have those same things. So who wins this race to market leadership? Who becomes the 800-pound gorilla in the space? Well, what we found is it's the sales team with the most consistency, rep to rep, in how they execute customer-facing conversations at every stage of the sales cycle. Second-rate sales organizations do not enjoy such consistency. And that results in this bell curve that I'm sure just about everybody in here is familiar with. You have very few top performers, maybe 10 or 20%, and they're killing it. They're doing 150% of quota. They've cracked the code. But their overachievement is offset by the below quota performance by everybody else who is scratching their heads, hasn't figured it out, and is making things up as they go. They make up their own talk tracks, they follow their own call structures, selling motions, messaging. And that's what you're left with. On the other hand, when you get every sales rep in your organization, or more realistically, almost every sales rep in your organization, selling the same selling motion, hitting on the same talk tracks, following the same call structure, and telling the same stories, you have a bell curve that looks a little bit more like this. You have a lot more top producers in this scenario. The few middle-of-the-pack producers are above quota, not below, thus not canceling out other people's performance, and very few low performers. So this is my favorite part. If you know anything about me, I like to talk about data. I'm a propeller head by nature. Any other propeller heads like data? I know there's more than 2 of you. So this is a recurring GIF. This is what I call a design flaw in the deck. Bear with me. At this point, this number is much larger. We have analyzed well over 2 million sales conversations with artificial intelligence. And we've done this from hundreds of companies. And among those companies are 12 what we call market-leading organizations. And we identified what those sales teams are doing differently than everybody else who is not dominating their market. These 2+ million sales conversations are recorded on web conferencing platforms, typically, like Zoom, GoToMeeting, Join.me, transcribed from speech to text, analyzed with machine learning to identify key selling behaviors like talk tracks, questions, customer objections, filler words, et cetera, et cetera. And then they are all mapped to CRM outcomes so we can analyze what correlates, and I want to be clear, not what causes, but what correlates with success. And here's what we discovered. There's a lot that we discovered. If you followed our research, you know that. But here's what we discovered between market-leading sales organizations. Sales teams at top-notch market-leading companies who have the lion's share of their market share have consistency rep to rep in what they do during customer-facing conversations. Talk tracks, stories, call structures, how they handle objections. It's fairly uniform, but without being scripted. And on the other hand, sales teams at companies that are really just not killing it, it's sporadic. Reps are talking about different talk tracks, they have different stories, tribal knowledge has not been shared throughout the organization. Some of them do discovery and demo on the same call, some of them just do discovery on the first call and then schedule a demo. It's very inconsistent. That is the key thing that we learned. And what we found is that when you do drive this consistency, you shift your bell curve. You get more reps meeting or exceeding quota. So here's the first data point, the supporting data point behind the thesis that we're covering here, which is consistency in customer-facing conversations. This is, this is a propeller head word for this metric. I call it question velocity. Nerdy, right? So question velocity is the rate of asking questions throughout the duration of a sales call. And up here at a market-leading sales organization, we are comparing top producers and average producers. Not that easy to tell a difference. There's not much of a difference going on there. But look closely. I'm about to change the slide to second-rate sales organizations, and look closely at the change. Look at the red chart. Look how crisp that difference is. At second-rate sales organizations, the average rep's question behavior is completely different. They front-load their discovery questions to the beginning of the call as if they have a cheat sheet, and they're going through each discovery question without actually having a conversation with the person. Meanwhile, the top producers, while they are still asking great questions, do it evenly throughout the call. They're having a natural dialogue rather than a light-in-your-face interrogation. So let's highlight the difference one more time. Market leading, not much of a difference. Not market leading, big difference. Let's go to the second one. The artificial intelligence that analyzes these sales conversations has the ability to identify what we call the call structure for introductory sales meetings. And that's typically made up of the meeting setup, which is like your meet and greet, small talk, discovery, pitch, back and forth conversation, and then next steps. When we looked at the call structures at market-leading sales organizations, we couldn't find a difference between top producers and average producers. They're pretty much doing the same thing. If they had a process to do 10 minutes of discovery on their first call and then do 20 minutes of demo and 5 minutes of next steps, more or less, they all did that. When we looked at the data from companies who were not dominating their markets, it was different. Some reps would do full discovery on their first meeting and schedule a demo. Some reps would do half and half. There was really no rhyme or reason. It was kind of Wild West. Speaking of Wild West, the messaging was very consistent in market-leading companies, and it was very inconsistent in companies that were not leading their market. So these are the talk tracks that were identified in first meetings in this analysis at market-leading sales organizations. Each of these rows are talk tracks, and you can see that there is a little bit of a difference between the bottom performers, the average performers, and the top performers in terms of how often they touch on those talk tracks throughout the first meeting in the sales cycle. But those differences, if you ask me, are pretty marginal, especially when I change the slide here and show you how different it is at sales organizations that are not dominating their markets. Very different. Top performers at these companies are talking about totally different things than average performers, who are talking about totally different things than low performers. This is what I call Wild West messaging. Being in product marketing, this makes my skin crawl just a little bit. Everybody's making up their own talk tracks. You have one guy or gal on one side of the sales floor who's making up their own stories, using different customer stories, different talk tracks. You walk to the other side of the sales floor, and you think it's a totally different sales team just based on what you're hearing. It's a different ballgame. They're talking about very different things. I'm looking at this red thing glaring at me. We have 8 minutes left. It's very intimidating. So I'm going to end with a couple things. We're going to talk about a success story of a company who went from one side of this fence to the other. And then we're going to leave some time for Q&A, hopefully. Touch Bistro. This is a company in Toronto, Canada, who sells point-of-sale software and hardware for the restaurant business. And this was their challenge. They had a very wide disparity in terms of performance between their super successful salespeople and everybody else. Here's what the protagonist of the story told us when we talked to him. This is Paul Snelson, Vice President of Sales at Touch Bistro. He said, we had tons of inbound leads. Marketing was doing their job. They were also quality leads, but our close rates were not keeping up, and I could not answer why. So Paul, having previously worked at Salesforce.com, turned to his CRM to try to answer this question. And what do you think he found? Probably a bunch of 30-character notes in each opportunity record that really didn't point to anything that he could use. That was his challenge. He didn't have visibility into what was happening during these customer-facing conversations. He had a very wide disparity between super performers, average performers, and everybody else, but he was kind of flying blind. What they were saying, what they were writing, what they were doing during customer-facing conversations was a black box. Once he got some visibility, he found out the problem. We had 70 reps handling their sales calls in 70 different ways. 10 objections handled in 10 different ways, 10 demo scenarios handled in 10 different ways. It's like a lead comes in, and instead of being smoothly processed through a machine into closed revenue, it's thrown into a tornado that flings it into a dark corner somewhere. This is what inconsistency does. So what he ended up doing is he heard about he talked to a few sales leaders in the Toronto area who had used this technology called conversation intelligence. And he analyzed the call structures, the talk tracks of what his top performers were doing at each stage of their sales cycle. What were they doing during the first call, the second call, negotiation, proposal, etc. He codified it. That was the first step. That's not enough, though. The second step is once you identify these things and you understand what good looks like at each stage of the sales process, now you have to help the reps who are not following this standardized process to get up to that level. And so they instituted a coaching framework where they would score every rep's calls, not just the average producers, but every rep's calls against what they learned their top producers were doing. Just quick detail on that. They found, one of the many things they found, top producers were presenting software, hardware, and services in a totally different order than average producers were. They found a lot of other differences, but that was kind of the one that stuck out to them. They defined that as good, and they coached everybody else against that framework. Over time, we all know coaching is not a silver bullet. It is not an instant fix. They were able to increase close rates for their account executive team by 10% across 70 reps. Across 7 reps, that might not be such a big deal. But when you start to hit scale, that 10%, big financial gain. And then you combine that with the SDR's performance. The SDRs were successful in converting 12% more of the inquiries that marketing was generating into qualified opportunities that account executives could then, quote unquote, process into closed deals. These two metrics, it's compound interest. This is not 1 + 1 = 2. This is 1 + 1 = 5. And this is what Paul said at the end. Greater percentage of their reps meeting or exceeding quota. They've killed it in 2018. They've gone from a sales organization that marketing was scratching their heads at. We're generating all these leads. You've admitted they're good leads. What's up? To a sales organization that is winning their unfair share of their market in the restaurant point of sale business. Couple takeaways. I'm more trying to sell you guys on the idea that consistency is a thing and is the underpinning difference between a great sales organization and one that's not. But here are a few takeaways to come away with. Define what good looks like at every stage of your sales process in terms of customer-facing conversations. There are many methods to doing that. You do not have to use technology to do that. But defining it and standardizing it and assessing whether it's working, that's step one. Once things are working and you've assessed that they're working and you've optimized them, coach everybody against that framework. And then finally, really the missing piece to making this work at an accelerated pace is getting visibility into customer-facing conversations to first define what good looks like, and then make sure everybody's following that. Do the first two, though. If you can't do the third, do the first two. Okay, so here is how you win the Apple Watch. Thank you for listening to the sound of my voice. I tend to like the sound of my voice more than other people do, I think. That's what my wife tells me. Here's how you win. Hopefully you've been taking pictures. If you have, post your picture on LinkedIn and write your favorite takeaway that you've learned from this presentation. And you have to tag both me, Chris Orlob, and Gong.io so that we can track it. If you don't tag us, we can't really track it. The second part you can ignore. I built this presentation before I got here. I thought there would be like lead scanners or something. That's usually typical for events, but we're pioneering new ways to do events here. So no scan. Although I will say this, we have to get in touch with the person who won. LinkedIn is a decent way to do that, but just to make sure, come stop by our booth. It's out there. Come give us either your business card or email address. I want to give this thing away by the end of the day, hopefully 5 p.m. I really don't want to be lugging this thing around. I'm sure you will. So that is how you win. Post this on LinkedIn. You can do it on Twitter for extra credit, but really I care about LinkedIn. And I would love to spend the last, apparently 59 seconds fielding any questions. One in the back.
Yeah, so getting clear on what a winning conversation looks like is one thing, but changing behavior and coaching to that behavior is a completely different thing. Any advice or what have you seen that companies have used to help change that once the insights are known?
I think every VP of sales or chief revenue officer has 1 or 2 directives that they want to give their sales team to implement during customer-facing conversations. Maybe they just bought Sandler training or Richardson. I know you guys are here. And they go, we just spent 200 grand. Are people using it? And so I can't really answer this question without really plugging the concept of getting visibility, but really getting visibility is the best way I know how. Maybe somebody else has like a more innovative way to do it. But if you're blind to what your reps are saying during customer-facing conversations, it's very difficult to ensure new behavior. And there are other ways to do it. I mean, you can call shadow, right? It's hard. Thank you guys so much.